thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here. It's a little strange. I have not been to Little Rock since 1993. So it's changed. I found my way downtown from the airport without a problem, and then as soon as I was downtown, I immediately got lost. No buildings looked familiar. As soon as I found the Capitol Hotel, I was like, okay, great. Now I can navigate from here. But so I don't know if you are aware of it. We have this election going on. Anyone paying attention to that? And because of that a little bit, when I knew I would be coming to join you tonight and speaking a little bit, I thought it might be fun to go back in time and talk a little bit about the 1992 presidential campaign. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that experience and that campaign was like, and a little bit about what was new and unusual at the time and what is totally different from what politics looks like today. And I don't like to talk that long, so what I want to do, I'm going to talk for 15, 20 minutes, and then hopefully we'll spend most of our time taking questions, because that's always more interesting. I'd be very curious to see what people feel like talking about. So, 1991, I was 25 years old, and I worked for the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley. Does anyone remember Tom Foley? So Tom Foley was a really good guy. You would think this was the world's best job. I'm 25 years old. I work for the Speaker of the House. I got an office in the Capitol, right? Literally, you look out the window and there's the mall. What could be a better job than that? The honest answer about this job is that I was paid to do almost nothing. So I was a 25-year-old policy advisor and speechwriter to a person who did not give many speeches. And his position on policy was, I got elected to the Speaker of the House because the chairman of the various committees, and back then it was all chairman, the chairman of the various committees all supported me for this job. And the reason they supported me for this job is because I told them I wouldn't tell them what to do. So the Speaker of the House's idea of policy was to try to stay out of policy and let the chairs of the various committees move whatever legislation they thought was important. And this was eye-opening, right? But not particularly that rewarding. So I'm sitting there in the Capitol, and I'm 25, and I'm very idealistic, and I'm very passionate about better government in America. And I start thinking, that I should take a leave from this job and go work on a presidential campaign and see what that is like. So, who to work for? I'm a big research person, right? So, a lot of people, a lot of different candidates were talking about running. And for me, very quickly, Governor Bill Clinton was the person whose campaign intrigued me the most. And I have to say, for those of you who are younger in the audience, it probably requires a little bit of context. These days, the Democratic Party in national politics is pretty successful. Right, so Bill Clinton served 8 years, Barack Obama served 8 years. It currently looks in the current presidential election like we might have another Democratic president. 1991, going back then, right, the Democratic Party had sort of driven off into a ditch of irrelevancy in national politics. So, right, we lost the 1968 election, we lost the 1972 election, we won 1976 because of Watergate, we lost in 80, we lost in 84, we lost in 88. And looking at this landscape, and obviously I wasn't a genius, there were many people who felt this way, really felt that the only way to get a Democrat elected to the presidency was if it was a Southerner. And right, you're looking back and you're thinking Carter and LBJ were the last couple people to be elected, right? So it was not an accident that those were the last two Democrats elected. And it'd have to be someone who had a more moderate position, more free market oriented, a little less of the traditional 60s and 70s Democratic positions that had emerged. And in a lot of ways, this resonated with me personally. I was a Democrat, but I was also a Democrat from Texas and a Marine Corps veteran, which the notion that our party needed to come back to the center in order to be more relevant in national politics really resonated with me personally. So I was interested in this guy, Bill Clinton. I have to say, never thought in a million years he would either be the Democratic nominee for president or would win the presidency. So this is late summer, early fall of 1991. Bill Clinton was at less than 2% name recognition nationwide. So it was 2% in the polls, but with an asterisk saying that means maybe no one knows who this person is. It was also George Bush was president and had an approval rating at that point that was astronomically high. The economy was still in pretty good shape. The Cold War was over for people my age and older. That moment was really profound and really important. And so a lot of people thought, look, whoever gets the nomination against George Bush is going to lose. And so this is really, really about the 1996 election. 1992 is going to be the warm-up. A lot of candidates are going to get in. A lot of the big candidates are going to stay out because it's not worth it. So I decided I would volunteer for Bill Clinton. I knew a guy in the Capitol named George Stephanopoulos. People watch George. He's on TV now all the time. I knew George pretty well. We had worked together. He worked for the majority leader, Dick Gephardt, and so I'd had some interaction with him. When George got hired to go work for Bill Clinton, I came along the next week. I guess the thing I would say about the opening of that experience is you have no idea how rinky-dink that campaign was in its opening phases. Right now, you got the Clinton School and the Clinton Center and the Clinton Library and the Clinton Foundation. So we were in was it a paint store? It was a paint store, a hardware store that had closed down. Yeah, it was a paint store. So we're in like a storefront, shut down, rent is cheap, paint store. And then when we got big time, we moved to this like palatial headquarters, which was so small. We had one television set, and that was in my office, which I shared with George Stephanopoulos and Bruce Lindsay. We had 3 desks crammed into this tiny room with the TV set. So it was a really low budget operation. We had not raised much money. No one had heard of Bill Clinton, and yet there was something really inspiring and pretty idealistic about it. I guess what I would say, looking back, there were a couple of things about that campaign that were pretty distinctive in retrospect. One of them was how important public policy was to that campaign. And particularly now, like in this presidential election, well, I'm a reasonably intelligent person and I follow the news pretty well. And what I could tell you about the policies that the presidential candidates are proposing is almost zero. I know Donald Trump had said something about a different way to negotiate trade agreements, and Hillary Clinton has said that she is going to do something to fix Obamacare and make it work better. That's everything I know. There's really been no discussion, really, about public policy. It's been completely drowned out by all the other things going on in the campaign. Back then, the campaign really was, especially in its first half, remarkably focused on public policy. So this was in part, I think, a reflection of Bill Clinton's personality. He truly was just fascinated with the most arcane details of public policy. He was interested in what had been tried everywhere around the world, what had been tried in every state, what seemed to work, what didn't. And he really wanted to have his campaign based around a set of sort of core policy positions. It was also, though, such a different time that the most important news sources at that point were still newspapers. The New York Times and the Washington Post were by far the most important news outlets in the country. And people referred to the months leading up to the first primaries as the primary of ideas. That you actually had people, right, before anyone votes, what people are doing is expressing ideas about the direction of the country and the policies that will take them in the right direction. And we're debating those. And credibility at that stage as a candidate really didn't come from polling. You could be at 0, like Bill Clinton was. It didn't really come from money. At that point, the governor had raised very little money. The credibility came from the quality of the ideas. So for someone like me, who is a 25-year-old, very idealistic policy person and speechwriter, this was just tremendously exciting. Being a speechwriter for Bill Clinton was a little like being, I don't know, the extra spare tire on a car. Not the main spare tire, but the extra one, right? Like you have one on the back of the car and then there's another little one in the trunk. When he needed a speech that was actually written out, Bruce Reed, who was a speechwriter, would work with him, and Bruce was a beautiful speechwriter. But the truth of the matter is, he almost never worked off anything that looked like a written text. Most of what he did was just these beautiful extemporaneous speeches about what was happening in the country, with a lot of local stuff mixed in. One of the fun parts of my job on the campaign was coming up with interesting facts about every place he went to. If you're going to Jackson, Mississippi, and you're going to talk about welfare reform, here's what you should know about the welfare system in Mississippi. You're going to Ohio, and you're going to walk next to a closed-down tire plant. Here's what you should know about employment in the tire industry in Ohio. And he would take all these facts and just weave them in to whatever he was doing. This focus on public policy meant that the first 6 months of my job were really, for lack of a better word, wonkish. The governor delivered a series of speeches at Georgetown University. They were on economic policy, domestic policy, foreign policy. Gathering he had this incredible network of friends who were experts in all these crazy fields. And one of my jobs was to call them all and ask them to send ideas to Bill so he could compile them in his head and work out what these speech drafts were going to look like. After we did those 3 big speeches, we kept cranking out policy statements all the time. It seems almost a little bit unreal now. We would draft these policy statements, right? No internet, no email. We would fax them if they were an emergency, or we would give them to someone physically and they would carry them to wherever the governor was for him to review. And he would mark these things up. He took time, right? The idea in the middle of a presidential campaign that he's sitting on a plane editing these draft statements capturing his positions on healthcare, human rights, or international relations. seems just very, very different from what politics is about now. It's amazing. It felt very small scale and personal. The governor had he had an apartment in New Hampshire to stay in during the New Hampshire primary, and every night I had to fax him the schedule of the next day's events, and this meant that he had to turn the fax machine on. And sometimes he wouldn't turn the fax machine on, so you'd have to call him at like 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning New Hampshire time and wake Bill Clinton up to remind him to turn the fax machine on. And then he's probably trying to go back to sleep and the machine's going, it was a different world. What seems to me a little unreal about all that focus on policy, I mean, I think it was really important. It's what put him on the national stage, was really the quality of those ideas and his ability to speak to them. The notion of a governor from Arkansas that no one had heard of becoming the Democratic nominee was highly unusual, and it was really winning that primary of ideas that put him in the position to win the nomination. But what seems a little bit unreal to me now looking back is, first, people actually believed that when you said something in a campaign, it had some relation to what you would do in office. And now I sort of think one of the reasons we don't talk about public policy is people assume that people are going to say things during an election and then they start over from scratch once they're elected and all bets are off, and you can't really take any policy pronouncements seriously. So there's a sense in which it almost seems kind of naive almost, the faith people had that actually what a presidential candidate would do was explain what they were going to try to do and then get into office and try to do that. The other thing that seems odd is we spent all this time thinking about what the governor would do if he was elected president, and we had no way of predicting probably the two most important things that shaped his presidency. One was the technology boom, which totally changed the economy. Had no idea that that was going to be the central driver of his 8 years in office. And no idea that terrorism, which he spent an enormous piece of his second term working on, that global terrorism would be again, right, a major shaping factor. So in some ways, the fact that we were transitioning, I think, from a point in time when things moved slower to a time when things moved faster. And right now, I'm not sure you could predict very much what the next 8 years will hold for the next president. And so in some ways, those questions of character become more important than the questions of policy, because you can interrogate their candidate's character in a way that their policy pronouncements may or may not have that much to do with reality when it takes place. The other thing that was really interesting about the campaign was a very different attitude toward the news media and communications. So, in the 1980s, the great communications mastermind was Ronald Reagan, and there's a piece of that which was somewhat technical, and a piece that was really not. The piece that was, I think, really fundamentally important about Reagan was that he had a small set of ideas which he believed in 100% and fought for consistently. And that consistency of what he would talk about ran all the way through his campaign and his presidency. And so people actually figured out something of what the guy believed just out of sheer consistency. I think the problem is that Democrats didn't really give much credit to Ronald Reagan for having a clear set of consistent ideas. And what they really attributed his mastery of the media to was an understanding of the news cycle. So in the 1980s, it's again a time that's now forgotten. What was really important was the 5 o'clock news. No one watched any news. There wasn't any news until 5 o'clock. And then the 3 national networks put on their news shows. And what Ronald Reagan was so good at understanding was if you only give them one picture and say one thing, they will have to put that on the 5 o'clock news. And so it was very frustrating. There was a famous incident when, do people remember the Iran-Contra scandal? Right, in the middle of the Iran-Contra scandal, President Reagan goes and gives a speech, doesn't say anything about Iran-Contra, but he's in front of a giant American flag. And the story that they ran at 5 o'clock on the news was, there's the Iran-Contra scandal and it's going on, and the president didn't address it. But the picture is him standing in front of a big American flag speaking. And one of Reagan's advisors said, look, that worked out great. They can have the voiceover say whatever they want, but as long as the picture is him standing in front of an American flag, we're fine. Right? Democrats watched that, and I think they thought, okay, that's really clever, right? We have to be more sophisticated at how we manage the news media. The Clinton campaign, I think, took this one step farther, and I think one of the reasons he won that election was he understood, and the campaign understood, that the news cycle was changing. It wasn't going to be the 5 o'clock news. It wasn't going to be one big news story. We were going to be in, if not a 24-hour news cycle, maybe a 20-hour. A 20-hour news cycle. The news was going to be continuous. Cable news was still relatively new, but it was totally changing what coverage was like. In the old days, people, if they had a negative story about a politician, they would often give you 72 or 96 hours to prepare your response before they ran the story. And this was true even in the 92 election. I remember there were times when the New York Times would say, we're going to run this story in 96 hours. You have 3 days to give us your response. But the TV media was heading in a very different direction. They were going to run stories instantaneously and live. And the thing the Clinton campaign was so good at recognizing is that you couldn't wait to respond to a news story 24 hours or 48 hours. You needed to respond within minutes of the news story breaking to have your context, your response in the initial news story, because it would change everything if both the news story and the Clinton response were captured in the same moment. And this was the sort of origin of the notion of having a war room at the heart of the campaign. I always hated that term. I feel like I was like the only veteran on that campaign. The number of veterans at that point running around the Democratic Party were pretty slim. And war and politics are actually very different. And so there was this sense, the term always drove me nuts. Be that as it may, the war room was really put together and designed to do 2 things. One of them was to respond instantaneously to potential news stories. And there was actually a sign. There was an anti-drug campaign where the motto was "Speed Kills," and people took that motto of "Speed Kills" and actually wrote it out on a sign and hung it up in the war room. The notion was that if you could respond quickly to a story with the facts, you could kill the story. So part of it was this very quick response, which no one really was doing quite like that in politics at the time. The other piece of it, which sometimes gets lost, is it wasn't just quick response. It was finding out what the problem was going to be before the story broke. So it was actually gathering information about what the potential problems were and figuring out your response before the news story broke so that you could respond. And so a lot of what went on in that war room was not crafting these sort of fact-based responses to news stories, but figuring out what the potential news stories could be and putting your response together in the week before that news story might break. That was so different from what people were doing at the time. It's become, obviously, the sort of bread and butter of what American politics has become. But at the time, that was really unique. I guess the last thing I would say about what was really unique about that campaign is that Bill Clinton was not only the candidate, but was overwhelmingly also the campaign manager. And that is really unique in American politics today. So the plan for the campaign really was to run as a moderate, to be the moderate alternative to Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, and then perhaps not to win, but to run in '96 and win. And that was what everyone was talking about when I first joined the campaign. I think the person who didn't really sign off on that vision was Bill. I think he thought he was going to win, and I think he thought he was going to win because he had the whole campaign in his head. The most remarkable thing about spending time with him then was that he sort of knew at a much more profound level what was happening and how his campaign fit in with the times than anyone else understood. He had, I think, a roadmap in his head of how to become president and was following that roadmap, something he'd thought probably about for 20 years. And it was playing out in his head. And as a result, he made all the important decisions. I remember, as an example, when the first story broke about Jennifer Flowers, it pretty much derailed the campaign. Bill and Hillary actually were in New Hampshire. They flew home, and there was a meeting to decide what to do. And Paul Begala and Jim Carville were there. They were the big campaign consultants. And I just remember the main contribution of everyone besides Bill and Hillary was, let's scrape as much money as we can together so we can rent very expensive lights, so that when we do this event in New Hampshire, the governor is really well lit, so he looks good on TV. Like, that was the staff contribution to the strategy. Everything else was Bill, which was really figuring out, not to pull out of the race, despite what the polls were saying, to go back to New Hampshire, to slog it out, and then declare victory regardless of what the results were. And things like that, it was just kind of remarkable to watch. And I don't think we'll see the likes of that ever again. It was a pretty remarkable thing to sit back and watch. It's funny, looking back in retrospect, how much political talent was there is still just pretty stunning. I guess I would say it was actually, the focus on public policy was very inspiring in the first half of the campaign. The second half of the campaign almost felt anticlimactic to me. I was traveling with Al Gore. I was supposed to help translate Clinton land for Al so that Al understood we were supposed to say and not say, and he thought we were just a little bit from outer space. We just seemed so unprofessional. I remember in Clinton land, a briefing book was this, 20 pages of stuff you faxed to the governor in the middle of the night. The first time I handed Al a briefing book that was a set of faxed pages stapled together, he looked at me and said, "What do you mean? That's not a briefing book." And I said, "Yeah, it's the briefing book." He said, No. A briefing book is like a book. It's usually leather, and you open it up, and right. It was just a completely different sense of what he was a United States senator. He found everything we were doing a little bit amateurish. But it was a little bit anticlimactic. I was reflecting at this time in 1992, all of us knew Bill Clinton was going to win the election. It was a three-way race. Ross Perot was in. The polling numbers in all the states he needed to win to be president were just rock solid. They looked really good. And so that, it's funny, the general election, I have very few recollections of it. I mean, I've got some funny memories. But the point that was really, I think, the remarkable experience was the primary campaign for me, because that's when, a group of people with a candidate with 2% name recognition sitting in a closed-down paint store in Little Rock, Arkansas, actually figured out a way to get that candidate elected president, which was pretty great. So just a few memories and reflections of what was different in those times. The media was different. The focus on policy was different. In some ways, the worst parts of the 1992 campaign have now become our reality of what most campaigns are about, and that's certainly comes with some cost. So with that, why don't we open it up for questions, and we can talk about whatever people feel like talking about.
Questions, surely going back to 1992, and if anybody wants to talk about
2016,
we
can talk about that.
We can talk about that too. So, questions? Any questions? Yes, there's one right here. It's coming right back.
Hi, my name's Chelsea Miller, and I'm a first-year student at the Clinton School. Thank you for being here.
Sure,
my
Chelsea.
question is, in 1992 and today, more about the 1992 election. How involved were you all with the down-ticket races, whether here in Arkansas or... I'm fascinated by how the down-ticket races have changed over the last 14 years, or 24 years.
My perception is that we were not, that's an interesting question. My perception is that we were not that involved at all. The one I really remember, we were on a bus trip. Even that notion, like the notion that the big innovation was you would drive a bus around, seems very dated at this point. We were on a bus trip through Pennsylvania, and we pull up, I want to say we're outside Valley Forge, so we're in the Philadelphia suburbs, and the weather's crummy. It's raining, and there's 9 people off to the side, waving Bill Clinton signs. And the bus pulls over, and the governor immediately runs out, and he's hugging everybody and high-fiving them. And the Democratic candidate for Senate is sitting next to me on the bus. And she turned to me and said, "Do I have to go out there?" And that's when I realized that was not going to be a successful campaign. So local candidates would come along on those events, but I don't remember anyone thinking we had amazing coattails or I just don't remember that much integration between the national campaign and the local campaigns, and I think that's a lot. It sounds funny, but now people will refer to coordinated campaigns now, where all the Democrats in a region or all the Republicans in a region will run one get-out-the-vote effort. But back then, everyone ran their own, right? Every candidate had separate lists and different volunteers calling those lists. So I think there just wasn't that same degree of coordination.
Yes, Gene.
You get two microphones.
Two mics. So I'm very impressed in the 2016 election with the commentary by Paul Begala. And thinking back to 1992, what was it like working with Paul Begala and James Carville both. I miss James very much, and I wonder, I don't know what's happened to him, but I watch Paul quite often, and I'm just stunned by his brilliance and his ability to, to really dive into what's going on. But what was it like in '92 working with both of them?
So, all right, I'm going to say something slightly controversial. Campaign consultants have a vested interest in making it sound as if they got people elected. And one of the things I always felt about the 1992 election is that Carville, to a pretty big extent, both took and got a lot of credit for being the sort of strategic mastermind of the campaign. And I always, just having watched it fairly close up, I always felt that the campaign was much less reliant on consultants than anyone would think today. I really think Bill Clinton was his own consultant, made his own strategic decisions. Paul, I remember mostly he was very funny, and he was actually a very funny speechwriter. And so the thing I remember most about him, our office was really tiny, and I remember the governor didn't like you to write him a speech, but he would be totally open to you sending him 3 or 4 lines that he might work into a speech that you thought were clever or interesting. And I remember Paul and George Stephanopoulos, their favorite thing was to hunch over a computer together, coming up with really funny things for the governor to say that the governor would almost certainly never say. And I really remember, like, Paul was from Texas, and Paul really liked the Southern Democrat feel of the campaign. And so he would always write these sort of kind of fake Southern things for Bill to say that Bill would never say. And then they would read them out loud, and we would all laugh. It's a long time ago. We were all such tiny kids. I mean, we were all in our mid to late 20s. If you were in your 30s, you were just like ancient, right? Ancient.
And McCoy and I were ancient.
Ancient. You and Bruce Lindsay were
Bruce
ancient.
was ancient.
You were
Bruce
ancient.
was ancient.
So that's what I remember most about Paul, was writing funny things to say. He hasn't changed much. His demeanor on TV is pretty much what he was like even back then. He's always been very pugnacious, and you couldn't have discussions with him. You just had arguments. So that's what I recall.
I've got a question. You're president of Reed College,
Yes.
which is a outstanding liberal arts school in the West Coast. Really great school. Really, everybody, no doubt about that. What do your students say about the 2016 election, particularly not necessarily in whether they're for or who they is, but the civil discourse, the style of the campaign? What do you see it? What's the reaction among young people in 2016?
So, Reed College is in Portland, Oregon. We're pretty progressive out there. So most of the students are deeply worried about the conservative candidate, deeply concerned about Hillary Clinton being too conservative. They would like a more liberal candidate to be running for president. The thing that's disturbing to me is that there isn't that much discourse on our campus about the election. And that is, I guess that's the thing that bugs me a little bit. Students are deeply interested in what's happening on our campus. They're deeply interested in some national and international issues, but there is not much of a discourse about the political campaign. that may be in part a reflection of the tone of the campaign, right? There's been very little to inspire anyone. So the notion that, in every campaign there's a group of young people who get inspired by the race and it changes their life and they go into public service because of that. And I just don't see that happening on my campus. So I guess I would say that's the biggest thing, is just the lack of political activity.
Yes, Ann McCoy. Hold on, here comes the microphone at you, Ann.
Do you think the young people were inspired by Bernie Sanders? And now, what are they going to do? Who do you think they think will fulfill his dreams?
You got a focus group around here, they might can tell you.
That's so interesting, because in my heart of hearts, I just don't believe young people in America were really inspired by Bernie Sanders. I'm so skeptical of that. I don't know, for people who are in their 20s, did Bernie Sanders, were people inspired by Bernie Sanders? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, so that just shows you I'm out of touch and aging. I guess I would say the one thing I would say about it, yes, I mean, he had a very clear message, and you can't be inspired unless there's a clear message, and so I think that was part of it. But it was also, in some ways, it struck me as a kind of a bitter and angry message as well, and it whether that builds that long-term sense of optimism and hope that I think needs to underlie public service. I question that. I mean, I guess careers in public service are really difficult, and to pursue that life, you need to have hope and optimism. And I think we spend a lot of time now denouncing government. It's become the thing, right? That it's a corrupt, rigged game, and that may mobilize people for the short term, but I don't know whether that mobilizes people to long careers of public service.
Francis. Yes, ma'am, right here. Now go ahead. We all can fight over the microphone. Just give it to somebody.
Hello, Mr. Kroger. My name is Josh Snyder. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. And early on today, you had mentioned that a lot of the Clinton campaign focused on public policy discussion. And I guess my question might be twofold. First off, do you feel that the other side of the campaign, your opponents for that campaign, also took a very public policy interest in terms of what they promoted with their campaign? And do you, perhaps in light of the question that we just had a second ago, do you feel that maybe the push away from public policy this time around has also driven perhaps young interest away from the campaign?
So, yeah, looking back, I mean, what's interesting is how focused people were on public policy in the 1992 campaign. President Bush actually, I mean, a lot of his campaign was about the end of the Cold War and what that meant for the country and how we had done that. And in some ways, it was his mission to really emphasize this moment in history, and it was Governor Clinton's mission to remind people as the economy went downhill during the course of that election cycle that their economic livelihoods were at risk. And even Ross Perot, I mean, Ross Perot probably doesn't mean much to younger people in the room, but right, he was famed for these presentations with giant charts with all this, like, here's the national debt, and here's our growth rate, and here's GDP versus productivity growth. So yes, it was a very wonky time. I think that was because the newspapers were still kings of the news cycle, they were going to credit or not credit candidates as being important or legitimate or interesting based on public policy. That notion of a primary of ideas, you never hear that. You hear now about the primary of money, right? Which is what makes you a credible candidate before the primaries is how much money you rack up. That's a very different thing. I guess I would say one of the things that I concluded in politics is that it's a lot easier to scare people than inspire them. Fear is easier to trigger than hope. And so what I think you see in politics right now is that playing out, that what the two sides are doing are really designed to make you fear that person. And right, there's very little about what the future looks like or what the challenges of the future are, and so that's turned it away from more substantive discussions. I guess I would say, I don't know that, I think you could still have inspiring politics without it being quite so wonky as 1992 was. I mean, I think that was kind of an anomaly. It was a rare moment in time and a rare collection of candidates that were comfortable operating in that realm. But I do think we're pretty shy on optimism and hope. And I think those things were present in 1992. I think it was a very optimistic time, and you couldn't be negative all the time. You know, optimism was politically powerful at that moment, and that just seems like we're in a very different spot now.
Francis, you got a question right here?
I'm just really concerned about the young people not being, interested, because I think they're going to be the ones affected the most by what the outcome is of this coming election. Are they being encouraged to register to vote, and are they, is anything going on campus that, talks about how this is going to, the outcome? And then also I wanted to ask you about the media, because I feel like the media has played such a big part in I think that's why everybody's so turned off, because they've had all of this, and they correct Trump, they'll say that he's lied about this, that, and the other, but it's in tiny little something somewhere, nobody ever sees that. They just put all of his stuff up there. And then, Hillary, they'll say she's more correct than he is on all these things, but it's in tiny little things that people don't ever read. So I blame the media for a lot of what's going on in the election today. I'd just like to know what you think about that.
So, I can't generalize that much, but I have had the same conversation with college presidents in other parts of the country, and there's just not that much political activity on liberal arts college campuses around the country right now. And I think that probably is pretty directly tied to what the campaign coverage has been like. The media today, it's very different. I mean, I never had the sense in 1992 that the media was doing what it did to make money. I mean, that may be naive, but you just didn't have a sense that that's really what it was about. Now it feels very much that it is what it is about. It is about which network can have the best ratings, and salacious things boost ratings, and conflict boosts ratings, and so that's what they're going to cover. There was a really interesting written journalistic piece a couple days ago that said, we're probably actually selling Donald Trump short. If you actually go to his campaign events, he actually talks a fair amount about what he wants to do for the country, but you'll never hear any of that in the coverage, because he will also say 2 or 3 things that are instantly quotable and make good TV. And so, yeah, I think we're, this has been a long time in coming. Many of you from the 60s will remember the famous books, The Making of the President, the Theodore H. White books about campaigns, and the famous book that came out during the Nixon administration was The Selling of the President, right? There was a sense that advertising had completely changed politics. And I think we're at the point where the only way people communicate is really through the media, and that is a filter that's really changed what politics is like, and I don't think that's going to change.
Carney, you got a question right here. Here you go.
You mentioned Bill being kind of the manager of his own campaign. How active do you assume that he is in his wife's campaign, and how effective?
I have no idea. The only thing that, so the last time I saw Bill was several years ago, and he was in Oregon, and I had a surreal experience. As someone who used to write stuff for him to say, I got to warm up the crowd for Bill Clinton at a rally. Okay. This is when I was Attorney General of Oregon, and it was actually fascinating because Bill was giving a speech to a union crowd, and he was just not connecting. Like no one was responding at all. It was a very kind of cold response, and I was sitting like right where you are, and he was up here, and in the middle of the speech, he paused and just looked over and started laughing and said, "Do you remember? I used to be pretty good at this." And so it was a very funny moment of sort of self-awareness, I think. So I have no idea. The one thing I would say, I spent a lot of time with both Bill and Hillary for a very short period of time, and then really have had very little contact with them over the years. But Hillary has always been very much her own person. And she would have her own sense of what her campaign was going to be like. And I mean, just my gut instinct from spending time with them is when she was Secretary of State, she wasn't asking him that much what he thought. And I could be wrong, but and I bet it's true of this campaign as well.
All right, yes, we've got a question right here.
My name is Susanna. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. Thank you very much for sharing your insights.
Sure.
It's been wonderful. So I have a question because myself and some of my fellow classmates and colleagues here, we are either starting or continuing on our public service journey. And I think what you brought up is a very good point about the lack of optimism and how much we need hope and inspiration to be in this field. And I was wondering what advice you might have or what your thoughts are for people who are starting off and want to bring that sense of optimism and hope back.
So I've spent most of my life in various forms of public service. And what I would say is that the great remedy for any kind of cynicism or negativity is to put yourself in a position where you're interacting with people and making a difference in their lives. Because it's at that moment that you'll understand the importance of what you do. Things may be happening systemically in the country that you can't change, but what you can change is the quality of the presence that you bring to those interactions with people whom you're trying to help. I actually found the first. After the '92 campaign, I went to law school, and I kind of found the Bill Clinton's first term kind of disappointing in certain ways. And my reaction to that, in part, was why I became a prosecutor. I thought, look, regardless of what's happening in the nation as a whole, I really don't like people who shoot people. And I think we'd be better off if we put people who shoot people in jail, and I can do that. And I wound up being, ironically, a mafia prosecutor in New York, which they like to shoot people, so business was good. But it was that feeling that, like, when you go home at the end of the day, the results were very concrete and very tangible. And I feel like when there are things happening nationally or in terms of policy in your field that are not inspiring, it's getting in touch with those, that the concrete results of what you do. I feel like as a college president, I spend actually more time with students than the vast majority of my peers, and there's some reasons for that, but one of it is just like, everything else can go wrong, but if you have a positive interaction that helps someone get on the right course in their life, that's worthwhile. So I guess I would say that when there is that negativity, that's at the moment where you need to focus small scale on your interactions with people and make a difference in their lives.
Got a question, Angela?
I also went to a very liberal, progressive liberal arts college in Ohio, and when I was there, I had to leave the college Democrats because I wanted to be for Bill Clinton, and they were convinced it was going to be Tom Harkin. So that's my background, but I'm wondering, you mentioned that you've spoken to other liberal arts presidents, and they're not seeing this movement on campus. Is it the same with some of the more conservative liberal arts colleges?
Well, you know, the thing that's been happening most in terms of with conservative students on all campuses and then on more conservative places is how to square idealism with Donald Trump. And what you've seen is a number of college conservative groups or college Republican groups endorsed the Republican nominee as a matter of course, and then concluded, either because of character issues or because they just felt he wasn't a true conservative within the meaning of what they thought, that they couldn't support him. So you've seen a lot more, I think, discussion and interaction on college campuses between Republicans than you have amongst Democrats. You know, I think insofar as there were a lot of people who were excited about Bernie Sanders, I don't think that translated at all to supporting Hillary. If there was a moment of activism for college students around the Bernie Sanders campaign, that didn't carry forward. So I think a lot of the discussion is really on the conservative side, and it's doing what a lot of people in the Republican Party are trying to do, which is to figure out where that balance between party loyalty and other factors works out for them.